Before Europe ever spoke the word America, the continent was already alive. Millions of people lived across its vast landscapes. They built cities of stone and clay, raised armies and temples, carved roads that reached into mountains and valleys. Yet one mistake, the miscalculation of a single man, would alter their fate forever. This is the story of Christopher Columbus, a man who did not search for America, a man who never truly knew he had found it. Why then was his expedition called madness? Who dared to trust him with ships? What vision met his eyes when he first set foot upon those unknown shores? And how did his voyage unravel into wars, epidemics, and the disappearance of entire civilizations? This tale is not merely about geography. It is about how greed, faith, and curiosity rewrote the very map of the world, and with it the destinies of millions. Suggest in the comments topics for new stories and subscribe to the channel. New bedtime stories come out here every day. Now, settle in. Make yourself comfortable. Let us begin. Before Europe dreamed of a new world, America already existed. Not as empty land waiting to be claimed, but as a living and intricate universe. A universe filled with empires, with laws, with rituals that echoed for centuries. In the valleys of what would one day become the United States, tribes raised earth mounds that rose as tall as towering buildings. They traded goods, harvested crops, and guarded sacred ceremonies passed down like whispered songs through generations. Further south, the Maya built their proud cities. Glyphs carved across temple walls told stories of kings and gods, while stone slabs bore star maps, their edges pointing toward the heavens. And in the highlands of Mexico, the Aztec Empire thrived. Their marketplaces swelled daily with thousands of people. There were palaces and armies, schools and aqueducts, laws as detailed as any European code, crimes catalogued, punishments clearly set. Beyond, in the great spine of the Andes, stretched the Inca world. They had no alphabet, yet their empire pulsed with order. Knotted cords held the memory of numbers, while roads wove through mountains like veins of stone, binding their dominion across thousands of miles. America before Columbus was no myth of savages. It was a continent of societies as real as any in Europe. People married, quarrelled, prayed, fought, and healed. Every people had their gods, their myths, their understanding of the cosmos. Some imagined realms of the dead beneath the earth. Others spoke of sacred bonds with animals. Many lifted their eyes to worship the blazing sun. Different beliefs, different worlds. Yet all of them shared one thing. None knew of the lands beyond the horizon, across an ocean they had never seen. Europe, however, had begun to sense something. For the medieval European, the world ended abruptly. At the edge of sand, at the wall of sea, or in fearful whispers, at a cliff guarded by monsters and black winds. But as the 15th century drew nearer, fear of the horizon began to shift. What was once terror started to taste like curiosity. Curiosity that would soon collide with destiny. He thought it was the end. It was only the beginning. It began with the East. In the Middle Ages, the very word East shimmered with wealth. From India and China came pepper and cinnamon, silk and jade, sugar and porcelain. Caravans carried these treasures across deserts and mountains. But each border brought new taxes, each road new dangers. And when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire, that ancient route was sealed almost entirely. The Portuguese turned their gaze south. Patiently, obsessively, they traced the edge of Africa. Year after year, ship after ship, they built trading posts on its shores, mapping winds and monsoons. searching for a passage to turn east and reach India by sea. This was the path of cautious calculations, of reefs and harbours, of storms endured. It demanded years, gold, and resolve. Yet another idea, wilder and less proven, began to whisper across Europe. What if the earth was not flat at all, but round? What if India could be reached not eastward, but westward, across the unknown? To many it sounded like madness. Scholars admitted the earth might indeed be a sphere, but they measured the ocean between Europe and Asia as impossibly vast. Still, some dared to believe otherwise. Perhaps the waters were not so wide. Perhaps beyond the horizon there was land. Legends began to stir the imagination. Tales of miraculous islands lying past the horizon. Stories of golden cities where rooftops gleamed with jewels and rivers carried spices like currents of perfume. Monks told of St. Brendan, who sailed across the ocean and reached Eden itself. Others spoke of Norsemen, of Vikings who once landed in Vinland, a fertile place beyond the sea. No one treated these tales as maps, yet they fueled desire. The fewer the facts, the stronger the myths became. And myths, instead of holding men back, pushed them forward. Where fear left emptiness, imagination drew promise. Inside this fragile hope grew a belief. The ocean could be crossed, and on the far shore lay wealth, land, survival. Not only survival, fortune. Fear and greed became unlikely companions. Fear of being cut off from the lifeblood of trade, of losing the race for spices and silks. Greed for direct access, for profit without middlemen. And beneath it all, pride. The conviction that whoever discovered a new route would crown their kingdom with unmatched power. Curiosity, greed, fear, and legend. Four forces entwined. Some longed for gold. Others sought to touch the edge of the world. Still others wanted proof that the horizon was no barrier at all. And so there arose a demand for a map that did not yet exist. First in the minds of men, then on paper, then in ports, and finally in sails stretched by wind. What followed was born of guesses, illusions, and faith in what might lie beyond emptiness. Opportunity. Opportunity to glimpse what could not yet be seen. Opportunity to reach first a nameless shore and claim it before any other hand. And while, on the far side of the ocean, people were harvesting crops, hunting, praying, and offering sacrifice to their gods, in Europe the first expedition was already preparing to depart. They did not know it yet, but soon two worlds would meet, and both would be forever changed. At the end of the 15th century, Europe itself stood on the edge of transformation. In Spain, the long Reconquista had come to its conclusion. Granada, the final Moorish stronghold, surrendered its gates. The Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, united their crowns, cleansed their treasury, and at last turned their thoughts toward horizons yet unseen. And into their court stepped a man whose name would echo through centuries, Christopher Columbus. He was born in Genoa, the son of a simple weaver. As a boy he left the loom for the sea, earning his way as a merchant, sketching maps, studying the stars, drawing his own schemes of navigation. He lacked university learning, yet carried with him a gift rarer than knowledge, unyielding persistence. His great idea, though, was a mistake. He miscalculated the size of the earth. He did not know that an entire continent lay between Europe and Asia. Still, he believed that if one sailed westward from Spain, holding a steady course into the sunset, one would touch the shores of India. At first they mocked him. Portugal turned him away. In England and France they would not even hear him. Only in Spain did his dream find an opening. A humble monk, Juan Perez, whispered into Queen Isabella's ear, urging her to grant Columbus another chance. She listened. A contract was signed. Columbus would be admiral of the ocean sea. He would govern any lands he discovered. He would take a share of their riches. The fate of kingdoms now rested on this unlikely mariner and his stubborn vision. By May, preparations began. In the port of Palos de la Frontera, 3 small ships waited: the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña. They were not mighty vessels, nor suited for the vast unknown. Fragile wood against an infinite horizon. Their decks lacked armour. Their hulls were not designed for oceans without end. Recruiting men proved harder still. Sailors whispered of the void beyond the horizon, of edges where ships would fall into nothingness, of monsters waiting in the dark waters, of magnetic stones that could tear nails from timber and iron from the very keel. Fear weighed heavier than pay. Yet, slowly, a crew was assembled. Many did not come by choice. Some joined to escape prison. Others because pardon or coin had been promised. Few understood where they were truly headed. They were told simply, to India. But their maps were only guesses, their course only faith. None among them had ever sailed that way before. On the morning of August 3rd, 1492, the flotilla slipped into the sea. Their farewell was brief. No salutes, no songs, no celebration. The shore believed they would never return. At first they hugged the safety of the Canary Islands, gathering provisions, repairing damage. The Pinta's rudder broke before Spain itself had vanished from sight. After repairs, they turned toward the open Atlantic. Now began the part of the journey where no knowledge guided them. Week after week the horizon remained empty. The winds blew steady and unchanging, the sun scorched, the sea rolled without end. Anxiety gnawed at the crew. Some marked the passing days with scratches on planks. Others whispered of turning back. But the ships pressed onward, deeper into the silence of waters without end, and with every mile the weight of the unknown grew heavier. Columbus kept a journal, yet even in ink he bent truth to will. He recorded shorter distances than they had sailed, making the ocean seem smaller, the homeland nearer. His men believed they were not yet so far from Spain. It was deception as survival. Each night they lifted their eyes to the heavens. The stars offered no guidance. No coastline appeared on the horizon. No sails of a passing ship. No familiar sign of life. At times, a lone bird settled upon the mast, or strands of seaweed floated across the waves. Columbus whispered, "These are signs. Land is close." But still, the sea remained endless. Then came the night of strange lights. Lightning flickered across the sky, twisting and unnatural. The compass needle quivered, strayed from north. Men murmured of doom, that the world itself was unspooling, that beyond this ocean lay nothing but chaos. One sailor dared to speak aloud what others feared. Perhaps the ocean was infinite. Columbus was silent, but inside he too trembled. Weeks dragged on. Mutiny crept into whispers, then into words. The men had grown weary. They did not know where they were, and their only chart was the captain's faith against the silence of the ocean. Columbus promised, if no land appeared within days, they would turn back. It was a fragile pact between leader and crew, bound by desperation. And then, on October 10th, signs multiplied. Birds circled more often. On October 11th, branches and broken wood drifted near the ships. And at last, near midnight, a cry pierced the stillness. Land. They did not know what they had found. They did not know this was no Asia, yet for them it was the end of an impossible voyage. They had crossed seas that no map dared to draw, and before them now stood a shore that would alter history itself. Morning came, the 12th of October, 1492. As the sun climbed slowly above the horizon, the 3 ships of Columbus reached the edge of an unknown world. A lookout on the Finta first glimpsed shadows on the water, then the outlines of trees. Columbus gave the order. The boats were lowered. He dressed in his finest clothes. With the flag of Castile in hand, a letter from the Queen close to his heart, and thoughts fixed on Asia, he stepped onto land. He believed this was one of the islands off the coast of India. The inhabitants called it Guanahani. He recorded the word carefully without comprehension. Their language was foreign, their gestures strange, but his conviction did not waver. Later, he would write in his journal that the island's people were gentle, kind, unarmed, and easily commanded. That very first day, Columbus raised the banner of Spain and declared the land property of the Catholic monarchs. He did not ask the people whose soil it was. He did not see them as sovereign. To him, it was destiny, his right to claim. The islanders approached curiously. They wore no metal, no woven cloth, only ornaments of feathers, beads, food carried in baskets. They looked upon the pale strangers with wonder, unaware that with their arrival everything would shift. Columbus accepted their gifts as tribute, a gesture of submission to authority. He decided they must be Indios, Indians, because he was certain he stood in the Indies, and with that mistake a name would be bound to them for centuries to come. A single word born of error, a single meeting born of fate, and with it began a story far larger than Columbus himself. In the days that followed, the fleet drifted from island to island. Their eyes did not linger on skies or forests, nor on the music of languages they could not understand. They searched for only one thing: gold. Columbus asked no questions of culture or custom, of laws or of gods. His questions, spoken through gestures and drawings, all circled back to the same desire. Where were the mines, the ornaments, the veins of treasure hidden in the soil? On one island he met men who wore small pendants of gold. They explained through signs that further south lay lands where gold was far more abundant. Columbus kept that promise of riches deep in his memory. In his journal he wrote, "If these people know of gold, then gold must be plentiful. If they resist us not, they may be converted to Christianity and used in service." His first impressions of the people were divided. He described them as open, welcoming, unarmed. Yet in the same lines he saw them as servants waiting to be taught Spanish, as resources rather than neighbours. To him they were not allies, but instruments. Meanwhile the crew adjusted to these new shores. For the first time they tasted unfamiliar fruits, touched plants they had never seen. There was tobacco, its leaves dried and rolled into tubes to be lit and smoked. There was the potato, the parrot, the palm tree, and the oppressive tropical heat that wrapped around them like a second skin. The land was beautiful, but strange, and the strangeness was enough to inspire both awe and fear. Columbus wrote confidently, "No dangerous animals, no great cities, no armies." But he was mistaken. He had only touched the margins of a world whose true heart he had yet to glimpse. He believed everything under control, that the islanders had already accepted his authority, that his mission was nearly fulfilled. Yet in truth he understood neither their words, nor their politics, nor their beliefs. He did not know that this was merely the first threshold, that beyond the islands of the Caribbean stretched a vast mainland, home to civilizations older and stronger than he imagined. He did not know that this world was deeper, more complex than it appeared from the shore. The ships pressed onward. In November they reached Cuba. Columbus was convinced he had at last touched the Asian mainland. He sent men inland in search of palaces and temples. They found neither. Instead, they brought back stories of a curious plant smoked by the locals, a plant whose leaves would one day change Europe. Tobacco. Then came Hispaniola, the island now divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Here, Columbus resolved to build the first settlement. Fate intervened. The Santa Maria ran aground and was lost. From its wreckage they built a fort. A few dozen men were left behind. Thus rose the first European colony in the Americas. With the remaining crew, Columbus turned back towards Spain. In his holds he carried little. Some gold, exotic plants and animals, a handful of captives. But above all he carried a story he believed was triumph. He thought he had found India. He thought the path was open. He thought trade would soon flourish across the seas. He thought he had reached the end. In truth, he had only set the beginning. In his letters, Columbus painted glowing images. He wrote of marvelous lands, of gentle people, of a great divine mission. Yet he did not see that with his first steps he had laid the foundation of a long chain of invasions. He did not know that gifts of feathers and fruit would soon be followed by cannons, that behind the priests would march soldiers. For the islands he called discoveries, this was not a beginning of life. It was the beginning of the end. When he returned to Spain in the spring of 1493, he found himself at the very centre of wonder. They greeted him not as a dreamer, but as the man who had unlocked the western passage to India. He himself barely understood where he had been, yet his ships testified with spectacle. Cages stood on their decks holding men with dark skin and feathers in their hair. In the holds lay baskets of maize and cotton, glittering stones, fruits no European tongue had tasted, parrots alive with impossible colour. And above all there was gold, small trinkets, pendants, even if only in handfuls. It was enough to ignite the imagination of a crown. The royal court welcomed him with honours. They called him Admiral of the Ocean Sea. His stories were repeated in awe. He spoke of islands lush with nature, of peoples ready to embrace Christianity. He swore there was gold beyond measure, greater than what he had brought. He promised that with more ships, more men, he would unlock inexhaustible riches. Isabella and Ferdinand listened and believed. His vision mirrored their hunger, power, wealth, glory, all within reach. He was granted a second expedition. But this time, everything had changed. The first voyage had been 3 modest ships. The second was a fleet of 17, with over 1,000 souls aboard. Not explorers now, but soldiers, craftsmen, officials, priests. This was no voyage of discovery. It was colonization. They sailed in the autumn of 1493. Soon they reached Hispaniola, where Columbus had left his garrison. But the fort built from the timbers of the Santa Maria lay in ruins. The men were dead. The cause remained uncertain. Perhaps conflict with the islanders, perhaps quarrels among themselves. Columbus resolved to begin anew. He founded La Navidad, then another settlement, La Isabela. He sought to establish order, to tighten control, to organize the search for gold. But gold was scarce. The trinkets worn as ornaments had no connection to deep mines or rivers of treasure. Expeditions were sent inland, information gathered, but no great discovery came. Still, Columbus pressed on, or at least he pretended to believe in mountains of gold. And when hope faltered, he turned to force. He set quotas. Each native was required to bring a measure of gold dust, and for those who failed, there were punishments. The first chains were fastened, the first nooses hung, the first uprisings stirred. The dream of paradise was becoming a nightmare. Meanwhile, in Spain, expectations grew restless. They awaited results, ships heavy with gold, fleets returning with treasures. Instead came whispers of disorder, of cruelty, of failure. Complaints spread. Among settlers, discontent deepened. Food was scarce, disease contagious, discipline unravelling. Columbus could command ships, but he could not govern men. He was a mariner, not an administrator. He knew how to sail into the unknown, but not how to manage a colony, settle disputes, or weave enduring ties with the native peoples. He believed that gold alone would solve every problem. He was wrong, so he sailed on. Seeking islands yet unnamed, he pressed further. He reached Jamaica, wandered again through Cuba. Everywhere he searched for the familiar scents of Asia, for spices, for pepper, for kings who ruled from golden palaces. He asked the locals if they had emperors, if they had elephants, if they had silk. They did not understand his questions. He did not understand that he was not in Asia at all. He was in a world entirely other. In 1496 he returned again to Spain, but this time without triumph. Shadows followed him. Rumours of brutality, of executions, of poor governance. He was still received at court, but now with caution. His aura of certainty cracked. Yet Columbus pleaded, "Give me another chance." He promised once more to find what did not exist. 2 years later he sailed again. His third expedition brought him to the mouth of the Orinoco in South America. For the first time, doubt reached him. The river was too wide, the plants too strange, the people too different. In a letter he confessed, "I feel this land may be part of paradise." And yet in public he clung to his theory. He could not admit his error. Back on Hispaniola, crisis boiled. Spaniards demanded greater power. The native people rose in resistance. Complaints reached Madrid like waves against stone. In the year 1500, the monarch sent an official with a single mission, to arrest Columbus. Shackled, he was carried back across the same ocean he had once crossed in glory. His rule was over. He was later released, but the crown no longer truly trusted him. Still, in 1502, aged and weary, he set out once more, his final voyage. He reached the coasts of Central America, searching desperately for a passage to the Indian Ocean, hoping to prove that his vision was true. But there was no passage, no gold, no cities founded. His ships were battered by storms, and he spent months stranded, isolated, waiting for rescue. In 1504 he returned to Spain. Old, ill, deceived by his own illusions, he begged for the titles and shares once promised. But Isabella had died, and Ferdinand no longer listened. 2 years later, Columbus himself died, never knowing he had found not Asia, but an entire continent. His life became the symbol of a paradox, the dawn of a new epoch built on error. He had sought spices and palaces but found wild shores. He promised gold but brought violence. He thought he held a map, but he stood on foreign soil without compass or certainty. And yet, his path became the point of origin. A new era had begun, though he could not name it. Ahead lay the conquistadors, the plagues, the fleets, the wars, the treaties, the colonies. But first there was one man who searched for one thing, found another, and never truly grasped what it was. The so-called discovery of America was not a mere line in a sailor's log. It was a spark that set off a chain reaction no one had foreseen. What began as a quest for a shortcut to India ended as the reshaping of the entire world. Geography itself shifted. Maps were redrawn. But more than the lines of coasts and seas, the very logic of history changed. After Columbus returned, the race began. Following Spain came Portugal, England, France. Some carried royal decrees, others private hunger. Some sought gold, others sought land, others sought souls. Each believed the right was theirs. In 1494, Spain and Portugal divided the world with ink on parchment, the Treaty of Tordesillas. Everything west of an imagined line belonged to Spain, everything east to Portugal. No native people were asked. They were not considered voices but features of the landscape, as if forests, rivers and oars. In the Caribbean, settlements multiplied. Each new governor promised greater tribute. Gold became the measure of all things, the purpose, the proof, the prize. Where it was not found, men were forced to labour. Where it was found, they were killed for refusing to surrender it. Communities crumbled, some fled, some fought, some submitted, none were spared. And after Columbus came others. Hernan Cortés landed in Mexico in 1519. He had little more than 600 soldiers. The Aztecs had armies, a capital of stone, temples and rituals, and yet Tenochtitlan fell. Why? Because the Spaniards were ruthless. Yes, because they bore weapons. But most of all because they carried with them something unseen. Viruses, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, diseases unknown in the New World. The people had no defence, one infection, and thousands perished. Villages emptied in weeks. It was not war in the familiar sense. It was an epidemic hidden in cloth and breath. By the middle of the 16th century, the native populations of the Caribbean had collapsed by 90%. Even as this devastation spread, ships kept crossing the Atlantic. They brought back treasure, ingots and textiles, exotic fruits and seashells, tobacco and people bound in chains. Europe absorbed it all greedily. Oranges and maize became common. The potato entered the diet of the poor. With it came a dangerous conviction that at the edge of the world lay an inexhaustible storehouse. Spain rose as the first global empire. American gold filled its coffers, but with it came conflict, corruption, religious intolerance, unrest. On conquered lands, churches were raised, but beside them rose camps. Baptisms were forced, conversions demanded. The cross and the sword walked hand in hand. What had begun as exploration now revealed its darker face. Those who refused baptism were enslaved. The system of encomienda allowed Spaniards to claim that they cared for the natives, while in reality it gave them the right to their labour. It was slavery in all but name. Soon, even this was not enough. The indigenous populations dwindled under the weight of disease, violence and despair. And so began the next chapter, the transatlantic slave trade. Ships carried human beings from Africa across the ocean, chained in the dark holds, while returning to Europe laden with sugar, tobacco and gold. Thus was born the triangle of death, Europe, Africa, America, each point feeding on the others. Even those who did not conquer directly felt the ripples. In England, fleets were built. In France, new trading companies were founded. Across Europe, markets swelled. New spices appeared. New diseases spread. new beliefs took root. A global economy was not imagined in books. It was forged on the decks of ships. But what of America itself? There, languages vanished into silence. Temples crumbled. Manuscripts were burned to ash. Where once cities stood, now stretched pastures for cattle. Peoples who had lived for centuries by their own laws suddenly found themselves subjects of a distant king. Their gods were outlawed. Even their bodies no longer belonged to them. The conquistadors who followed Columbus no longer pretended to be explorers. They came as conquerors. They carried papal bulls, royal decrees, charters heavy with seals. They spoke in the name of God, but their true allegiance was to gold. Each longed to be the new Columbus, not in geography, but in profit. In Europe, his name became a symbol of triumph. In America, a symbol of ending. What had been called a discovery was not a door into a new age, but a blow struck against those who already lived upon the land. And yet, it had all begun with a map that did not exist, with the illusion that India was closer than it was, with the mistaken belief that Earth was a globe to be circled without consequence. But the Earth was not empty. The Earth was filled with living peoples, and the so-called discovery of their world was no neutral act. It was invasion. Columbus himself did not know what he had begun, yet his single step set in motion a chain of events from which history has never been cleansed. For history is not only what is written in journals, it is also what is burned, erased, forgotten, and in the case of America, it is the silence of millions of voices that will never again be heard. With each passing decade after the first landing at Guanahani, the meaning of the name Christopher Columbus grew ever more symbolic. His real life, with its failures, petitions, imprisonments, and losses, was gradually replaced by an image, the hero who opened a new world. His voyage was presented as triumph, as proof of European spirit, courage, and faith. But was it truly so? For Columbus died poor and overlooked, his titles stripped, his income reduced. His sons fought long legal battles to recover what the crown had promised, and he himself never knew he had discovered a new continent. To his dying breath, he insisted he had merely found the road to Asia. What he failed to understand became the foundation of a myth. After his death, in the centuries that followed, Europe shaped its picture of the world, and in that picture the figure of Columbus became convenient. One man, one voyage, one date. It looked clear, simple, monumental. The discovery of a continent was reduced to a single name. The reality that millions already lived in America, that civilizations thrived there, did not fit the tidy narrative. There was no room for the Maya, the Inca, the Cherokee, the Mohawk. Their histories were too unsettling, too contradictory, easier to silence them and to elevate Columbus. In the schools of 19th century America, Columbus was presented as a founder. Cities, states, universities bore his name. In 1792, 300 years after his first voyage, the United States raised monuments in his honor. By the 20th century, Columbus Day was a national holiday. The story told was not of trespass, but of triumph, not of a land entered without permission, but of a land nobly discovered. But time moved on. By the dawn of the 21st century, the myth began to crack. Historians asked, why do we say discovered when millions were already here? Why celebrate a date that began the destruction of entire peoples? Why call it only great when its consequences were so grave? In parts of Latin America, Columbus Day was renamed the Day of Indigenous Resistance. In some places, abolished entirely. Elsewhere, it became a day of cultural diversity. People began to look again, to question. Monuments turned to battlegrounds of memory, seen by some as heritage, by others as symbols of injustice. In the end, perhaps the issue was not Columbus himself. He had become a screen, a cover onto which an entire age projected its meaning. A book's frontispiece, seldom read beyond the title. Columbus sought one thing, found another, understood a third. His voyage marked the beginning of a global exchange that reshaped the earth itself, its climate, its economies, its crops, its faiths, its peoples. Europe gained potatoes, maize, tomatoes, chocolate. America received disease, slavery, iron, the gospel. It did not happen in a day, not even in a decade. But it began the moment 3 small ships touched an unfamiliar shore. So the question is not whether Columbus was hero or villain. The deeper question is why we continue to tell this story as though it were simple. Why we search for a single meaning when its truths are tangled. Why we still call it a discovery, knowing it cost so many their lives, their lands, their names. History does not exist to comfort. At times it is harsh, at times cruel, at times without reason, but it is ours. And to understand how we arrived here, we must learn to see not only the heroes who were remembered, but the millions who were erased. Not only the path of the ships across the sea, but the imprint they left upon the shore. The ocean still whispers of it, the maps still carry its shadow, and the silence of the lost still lingers.